Hello and welcome to Conversations With, our monthly series of informal and enlightening conversations between the leading edge teacher and author, Jim Self, and some of today's most progressive and connected teachers, channels, and authors. Now, here's our host, Jim Self.
But is there another aspect of this, and I know you speak to this, is there a consciousness shift? Not quite as definable as a cold day or a warm day, but is there a consciousness shift? Is there an opening in the heart or a closing of the heart as these cycles begin to unfold?
Jim, it's a good question, and I think probably the best way to answer that, I'm going to back up about a half a step here. In the book, Deep Truth, we identify the fact that the way we solve our problems is determined by the way we think of ourselves. And then that leads us to ask, where did we learn to think about ourselves? Where do we learn to see ourselves the way we do? The answer to that question is, for the last 300 years or so, since the birth of modern science during the time of Isaac Newton, we've relied largely upon science. Sometimes it's very conscious, sometimes it's a little less, more subconscious. But we've relied upon science in the modern world to tell us who we are in the world, to define our relationship to the world.
Yes.
That's important to know, because new science is now telling us where our thinking is either incomplete or whether it's flat out wrong. And in the book, I identify 5 key assumptions that have been made that we now know are false assumptions. And if I could just zip very quickly, and then that, I think, will be the foundation to answer the questions that you're asking about. And for our listeners, you may be familiar with some of these, and some of them may be very new. So, are you okay if we just go through these very quickly?
Yes. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Great.
Yeah. Well, when I was in school, again, back in the 60s and 70s, many of our listeners, when they were in school, even more recently, if you have young people in school today, these assumptions are being taught as fact. And any competing ideas, competing theories with these are not being allowed in the classroom. And I'm not saying we need to replace everything that we've taught for the last 150 years. I think it's honoring and truthful to our young people to share with them the new discoveries so that they have all the tools, the big picture, and they can make the choices they need to make. So the first one of these key assumptions, no surprise, it's based on the work of Charles Darwin. So the first assumption we now know is false is with regard to evolution. We were taught that evolution explains life itself and human life specifically. The problem is the data no longer supports that. The physical data doesn't support it. The new DNA research, now that we're able to look at DNA and compare DNA in ways that certainly Darwin couldn't in his time, it's telling us that this is not the explanation for human existence. Evolution is a fact in the fossil record. We can see it for plants and some animals. When it comes to humans, it doesn't apply to the 200,000 years that modern human has been here. I don't know what the answer is. I have my opinions, but scientifically, evolution does not explain life and human life. That's the first false assumption. The second one is with civilization, with regard to civilization itself. Well, we mentioned this a little earlier. We've been taught that civilization is about 5,000, maybe 5,500 years old. It began with ancient Sumeria, the Mesopotamian Valley. It's linear, that we are at the pinnacle of sophistication, at the top of that linear movement. The problem, again, is the data that no longer supports it. Peer-reviewed archaeological evidence is pointing to cyclic advanced civilizations, and they're now, the dates are accepted right at the end of the last ice age, twice as old, is what we've been led to believe. That's not showing up in the classrooms, although it's accepted science. Number 3 is with regard to physics. We've been taught that consciousness is somehow separate from our physical world. The best science of our time is showing us nothing could be further from the truth, and even people like Professor John Wheeler, Princeton University, a colleague of Einstein's, he died in 2008, was very adamant that you cannot separate consciousness from the physical world, and when you do, you write us out of the equation, and that's why we cannot complete the equations for the unified field theory. Right. So the data doesn't support it, but we're still being taught in school, actually they don't talk about consciousness much at all. False assumption number 4 ties into this. It says that the space between physical things is empty. We now know there is no empty space in nature. There's no empty space in the universe. There are forms of energy that don't act like we expect it to act, so we don't have machines to detect it. But the implication, living in a world where we think the space between physical things is empty, is that everything is separate from everything else, and that what we do in one place has little effect on anything anywhere else. And now we know that that's absolutely false. And the last key assumption that we now know is a false assumption, again, comes back to the work of Charles Darwin. And I'm going to use Darwin's own words here. Darwin wrote in his text in 1859, his own language, that nature is based on what he called survival of the strongest. It was later interpreted survival of the fittest. Darwin saw it as survival of the strongest, and this is a very, very dangerous way to think, because although the ideas were introduced in the late 1800s, that is precisely the period of time when the foundations of our civilization were being built. Darwin's ideas are deeply entrenched into our world and our lives today. Everything from the global economic system that's collapsing to the corporations that are falling apart, to the way that we're sharing disappearing resources, to the way that we are going about solving the big problems of the world, just like what's happening in the Middle East right now. The false assumptions have led us to believe that nature, we live in a world of survival of the strongest, that we live in a world of scarcity, where there's a single pie, and we all have to fight for our slice of the pie. And we now know that that thinking, the consequences of that thinking are the extremes that we're trying to deal with right now. So if we continue to solve the problems with the thinking that led to the problems, we all know where that's going to lead us.
Sure.
So these are the 5 key assumptions. Every one of them, it's not my opinion, they are peer-reviewed, categorically now determined to be false assumptions of science. And the new discoveries are not being shared in the mainstream.
Right. Fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, this ties into so many of the things that we've talked about in this program today. And the idea, I know for sure, if you had Bruce Lipton on here, he talked about Darwin's ideas. Bruce and we've been friends for 20 years. We've toured the world together. We co-present out of this country, not so much in the States. We co-present together a lot in Europe and Australia. And our programs naturally dovetail well because the work that we've done in our own ways in Darwin's ideas. The new science, just so our listeners are very clear with this, number 5, nature based on survival of the strongest. The best science of our time is telling us that is absolutely wrong. That survival of the strongest, we do see examples of it in nature in response to specific conditions, but that those examples are aberrations of the overarching rule, and that rule is that nature is based upon what is called mutual aid and cooperation rather than conflict and competition. So there were 400 studies that were done late 20th, early 21st century, and they were investigating conflict. And in biology, violent competition is determined. Well, I want to back up. There are 2 kinds of competition, and we've all been given different stories about how valuable competition is, and it can be. It depends on which form it is. There is a form of competition where an individual or a group benefits at the expense of another, where an individual or a group exploits the weaknesses of another, and that is a form of violent competition. So that's one form. There's another form of competition where an individual or a group excel in their particular endeavor because they have taken and honed the abilities of that endeavor to the greatest degree. And by becoming the best at what they're doing, they make the other ways of doing the same thing obsolete. That also is a form of competition. So
Sure.
What the studies were showing was that the optimum amount of violent competition in any environment is 0. in the classroom, in the playing field, in the workplace, is zero, that always, individuals and the groups are hurt by the competition. They all benefit from the cooperation. And a very prestigious journal, New Scientist in 2008, April, I believe, of 2008, there was a beautiful essay with a direct quote that said, "What we see in the wild is not every animal out for itself." That nature is based on a model of cooperation, and when the cooperation breaks down, the results can become disastrous. So when we think about that and we look at the world and we say, well, look at all the competition out there, if the competition is an aberration of the natural rhythm of life, it means that we are living in a world deeply entrenched in the aberrations that lead us away from our truest nature. But there's one more piece of this that really brings us all together. I want to go back to civilization being about 5,000 years old. All of the advanced civilizations that have been found, in the book I talk about, they're in Peru, they're in Egypt, they're in Turkey, they're in India, as different as they are geographically, there's a common theme through all of them, and that is in none of the civilizations older than 5,000 years have there been found any evidence of weapons. No weapons have been found. No evidence of large-scale war to solve problems. No evidence of the need to defend homes and communities with walls or with moats. No large-scale or mass graves that you would expect at the end of, or mutilated bodies with severed limbs and axes and skulls and all that.
Sure.
That all begins when we're told that civilization began 5,000 years ago. And historians now are beginning to suspect and actually write that war, this violent competition that we've been led to believe is so natural, that war is actually a habit. And it's a bad habit that began at the beginning of this cycle of civilization 5,000 years ago. And it suggests if war is a habit that is learned, that we can also unlearn it. And I believe that's precisely what we're witnessing right now. A generation's going to turn its back on war as a way to solve the big problems of the world. And I think I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing publicly as well as behind the scenes. I think we're going to get really close. But I think it's not going to play out the way that a lot of people fear it's going to play out. The archaeology of civilization is actually supporting the new discoveries of nature, showing that advanced civilizations in the past were found a way to solve their problem anyway without the use of war. And this is why it's so dangerous to think of ourselves through the eyes of these false assumptions.
If you enjoyed this highlight from Conversations With, join Jim Self live on the Awakening Zone Network. That's awakeningzone.com. If you're looking for free tools for your personal and spiritual growth, if you want to be who you came here to be, visit masteringalchemy.com, where you can learn more about Jim, his work, and future guests. Our theme song is Hands of Love by Barry Goldstein. May you experience laughter and grace on your journey home.